Hi, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Veidlinger, and I am the director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute here at the University of Michigan. I welcome to this afternoon's Samantha Woll Dialogue on the topic of can we move from October 7th and the war in Gaza to peacekeeping? Thank you to all of you joining us and coming out on this, well, sunny but windy day. All of the faculty, fellows, alumni, visitors, particularly the students, including those who are enrolled in the course on the World After October 7th. Thank you as well, President Grasso and Regents Hubbard and Brown for joining us here today. And thank you to the staff of the Wallenberg Institute, Miriam Mora, Eleanor Camp, and Joe Johnson, who I believe is outside. Thank you as well to the family of Samantha Woll, to Margot and Doug Woll, and Monica and Ben Rosen for making this whole series possible. Samantha Woll, after whom the series was named, was a proud graduate of the University of Michigan, a passionate community leader, a committed grassroots organizer who spearheaded advocacy programs and events focused on women's rights, fair trade, labor, civil rights, refugee rights, the State of Israel, and more. During her time here at the University of Michigan, she served in the Michigan Student Assembly, contributed to the Michigan Daily, and represented students as the university's delegate to the Ann Arbor City Council. Her greatest impact, however, was felt through her unwavering dedication to building bridges across religious, ethnic, and political divides. In October 2023, at the age of 40, Sam was tragically murdered in Detroit. At the time of her passing, she was serving as the president of the Isaac Agree Downtown Synagogue. Her influence, though, extended well beyond her faith. She used her ability to listen and to unite individuals to found the Muslim-Jewish Forum of Detroit, which she did in 2015. Part of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute's public programming, the Samantha Woll Dialogues address difficult topics suited to the challenges of our era, with an emphasis on the Wallenberg's mission of studying and combating ethnic and religious hatreds of all kind, fostering cross-cultural understanding, elevating civic discourse, and developing strategies to fight anti-Semitism, divisiveness, and discrimination by fostering the values of Raoul Wallenberg of empathy, tolerance, courage, and leadership. I recognize that today's topic is a difficult one. Continuing violence in Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and in the last week, the horrifying slaughter in Iran, all resonate here in America and on this campus and remind us that the war is very much not yet over. Yesterday's return of the remains of the last Israeli hostage held in Gaza and last week's formation of the Board of Peace do little, I think, to lift our spirits and inspire confidence in the future, although they are remarkable feats in and of themselves. But we remain, I think, as divided as ever. Yet universities, and particularly public institutions like our own, have unique roles to fulfill, not only in educating and empowering the next generation, but also in serving as a marketplace of ideas where diverse viewpoints and perspectives can be freely expressed, evaluated, and critiqued. In facilitating this type of discussion, we can unite as a community in the pursuit of knowledge and a better world. And that's really the mission of this lecture series, of this dialogue series. I want to take the opportunity, therefore, to remind you all that the university's deep commitment to freedom of expression does not extend to the right to substantially disrupt or interfere with the lawful speech of others. You will all be receiving index cards, or will have index cards available in the next half hour or so, and we encourage you to write down any questions that you may have on those index cards, which Eleanor over there will be collecting in about half an hour, and we'll use those cards to guide the last segment of our conversation. It is really valuable and vital to have the discussions that we're having today across differences. I would now like to invite onto the stage our two speakers, who I will briefly introduce as they make their way to the stage. So maybe I'll invite you to come sit down and turn on your microphones. And maybe I'll sit over there to introduce I'll still stand here. First, Khalil Shikaki is Professor of Political Science, Director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah, and a member of the Steering Committee of the Arab Barometer. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University, and has taught at several universities in Palestine, Israel, and America, including the University of Michigan right here. Shai Feldman, in the middle seat, is the Raymond Frankel Chair on Israeli Politics and Society at Brandeis University's Crown Center for Middle East Studies, and was also the founder and director of the Crown Center. He has served as president of Sapir College, as well as a member of the board of directors of Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and a member of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Together, the two of them, along with Abdel Monam Said Ali, have written several books in a series on Arabs and Israelis, most recently Arabs and Israelis from October 7th to Peacemaking, and in 2022, another book called Arabs and Israelis, Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East. And the conversation today will be informed by that book and the course as well that the two of them teach together at Brandeis University. So I'm really pleased to have both of them here with us today, and please join me in welcoming them. And I just want to commend them as well on the heroic endeavors they underwent in order to get here from Boston through the snowstorms that we've had over the weekend. And they were sitting in the Boston airport for 3 hours this morning after changing their flight from yesterday, and got here just in time for our event. Haven't even had lunch yet, but I welcome them in their efforts to get here. So we'll begin, I guess, by talking a little bit about the prehistory of October 7th. You know, as a historian, which I am, it's always difficult to start. When does one begin the narrative? At what point does everything begin? You know, we're teaching a course right now through the Wallenberg Institute called The World After October 7th, but of course, it's difficult to start there. What happened before October 7th? How do we understand October 7th without understanding what took place before? I wonder, therefore, if you could give us a sense of what led to October 7th, 2023, both from a regional perspective and a global perspective, and starting with Khalil. And you have the microphone. Do you have your microphone on from the?
I think so.
Everybody here? If not, I'll just pass around the microphone. So raise your hands if you can't hear once they start.
1, 2, 3.
You can't hear? Yeah.
Mine is not on. It should be on. It is on.
Yeah.
Not working?
It is. All right. Thank you, Jeff, for inviting us, and thank you for coming. We thought with all the snow, we're not going to find many people here. So delighted that you are all here. This monograph that you've mentioned, Jeff, is something that we started about 1.5 years ago. After October the 7th, Shai and one of our colleagues, an Egyptian colleague who's not here with us, and I decided to have a conversation to see if this is it, or if there is anything that the three of us can do. The reason that we thought we can do something is because we've tried in the past. We failed, I must say, but we've known each other for more than 40 years. And during those 40 years, although we're all political scientists, we're not activists, we do not work for governments, we're all part of what you can call civil society, but also academia. And so we wanted to put our knowledge into practice. And in fact, this is exactly what we have been doing for the last 40 years. And Shai and I in particular have been involved in Israeli-Palestinian matters, trying to find solutions to problems, creating small groups of experts. The goal was essentially to advise policymakers. So we were what you can call second track. That is, people who are not officials, but we were reporting to officials, when officials want to know what are the limits of the possibilities without committing to anything, we were there to help, whether it was our own initiative or something that they had in mind. This time around, it was our initiative. We wanted to get together to see if something can be done. And so we wrote this monograph. The monograph is essentially about October the 7th, thinking whether October the 7th has created conditions that would make it impossible for Israelis and Palestinians in the future to find a way to a peaceful solution. As we do in all cases, we essentially try to assess why this had happened, what were the conditions that might have led to it. And in doing so, like in every, we wrote a textbook. The three of us wrote a textbook on Arabs and Israelis, conflict and peacemaking in the Middle East. The textbook essentially looks at all the major turning points in the conflict during the last 100 years. And it begins by taking these major developments, analyzing them, looking at first the big picture. That is the nature of the international system, the regional environment, and then we look at the domestic conditions, and finally we look at individuals. Individuals in particular who make those decisions. Sinwar, in our case, is the person who made the decision. For those of you who don't know who Sinwar was the leader of Hamas in Gaza. This entire plan was his own. He has spent some 7, 8 years putting it together. The environment we're looking at is the Israeli and Palestinian domestic environment. I'll come to that in a minute. But first, I will answer your question about the nature of the international system and the regional system. Why were they conducive to October the 7th? Well, I'm not necessarily saying this is what led to October the 7th, but this is the context in which this had happened. Had the context been different, we might not have had October the 7th. There is absolutely no doubt about that. The nature of the environment at the international system was extremely negative. Since 2014, there really has been no serious efforts on the part of the US, which more or less has been the most important player in peacemaking, to try and get the two sides to talk to each other. Trump tried, but did more damage, he produced a lot more negative outcomes than positive outcomes during his first term. The deal of the century essentially sent a message to the Palestinians that the US is no longer an honest broker in any kind, shape, or form, and that therefore there isn't going to be any kind in the near future of a peace agreement that could end Israeli occupation and lead to a Palestinian state. So keep that in mind. If you're a Palestinian, that is what you had to live with since Trump and his plan. So by 2020, the picture in terms of the international system looked extremely grim. But also at the regional level, things were as bad, in fact, in terms of how it was perceived by the Palestinians. In fact, if you go back, not too much, but since the Arab Spring, there has been a lot of inward looking in the Arab world. The Arabs wanted to look at what on earth had happened in the Arab Spring, why we had so much destabilization in the region. And so there wasn't a great deal of attention being paid to the Palestinian issue. There is one country that paid attention. I'll come to that in a minute. But the rest of the Arab world essentially was consumed with its own difficult problems and the need to focus on economic issues to improve conditions in their societies. There was even more bad news for the Palestinians. And the bad news was that this inward looking with focus on economic issues and prosperity and so on, particularly with the rise of Iran, this is another regional player who had a significant impact on the decision of October the 7th. The region felt, some countries in the region felt that Arab-Israeli normalization can proceed without the Palestinians. This was the exact opposite of what the Arab Peace Initiative. Since 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative basically was a solution to the Palestinian problem first and foremost. It wanted to resolve the problem by offering regional peace. All Arab countries would recognize the state of Israel and make peace with the state of Israel. In return, Israel would end occupation, a Palestinian state would be created. That was the plan. What comes first, Israeli-Palestinian peace. Normalization, a la Trump, given the post-October Arab Spring, was one in which the focus was inward. And the Palestinian issue was secondary. And therefore, we had normalization. So that's yet another grim part of the picture that the Palestinians on October the 7th lived under. Certainly there was other things that were happening in the region relative to what, in relation to the Palestinian issue, and that is what was happening domestically and how the region impacted. The most important country in this case would be Qatar. Now, Qatar has been, has done a lot of efforts since October the 7th to help resolve this conflict. But before October the 7th, the main role that Qatar had played was to help essentially subsidize Hamas's control over Gaza. This was not the Qataris' idea, by the way. This was this country's idea. This was the U.S. idea with Israel supporting it. So Israel, the U.S., asked Qatar to help Hamas run Gaza. Why on earth would they want Qatar to subsidize Hamas's control over Gaza? Because by then, now looking at the domestic environment, you had the Netanyahu government in Israel. You have a right-wing government in Israel that was not interested in promoting the idea of a two-state solution to the conflict. The idea that Hamas can remain in Gaza and Abbas or the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah separated, this kind of division suited very well with the idea that the two-state solution is not really the best thing for Israel. On the Palestinian side, things were as bad. This division could have been resolved long time ago. I would say, I'm not going to, I can say the initial division, that is what Hamas did violently on another violent day in June 2007, was to take over Gaza violently. That decision was certainly a decisive decision that led to the separation of Gaza from the West Bank, and eventually to October the 7th. But we had a lot of opportunity, we, in this case, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, to try and reunify the West Bank and Gaza and reconcile with Hamas, bringing Hamas on board as part of the Palestinian political system. We have failed to do so. We had a chance in 2021 when the idea of holding elections came about, and we were about to go to elections, and the Palestinian president 1 month before that canceled those elections. In my view, the decision to go to October the 7th perhaps started that day. Started the day that we canceled the elections, and with canceling the elections, we essentially canceled Palestinian internal reconciliation. I have a lot more to say, but I know I took more time than you wanted me, so I'll
Actually, before, is this mic on? Yeah, actually before, maybe I'll follow up with a couple of follow-up questions for you before I move to Shai. And that's two factors that I want to ask about. So one, you talk about the way the Abraham Accords left the Palestinians as a back burner. Wondering what you think of the discussions to extend that to a treaty with Saudi Arabia, if that was a major factor in October 7th as a way to derail those talks.
That's a very good question, because it brings me to the issue of timing. When was a good time if you are Sinwar? If you are Sinwar, and he is by far single-handedly planned this whole thing, and probably any other Hamas leader would not have done what Sinwar did. I would say that the Saudi normalization and the interest in doing it as quickly as possible, with the Crown Prince talking to Fox News that it's being done, soon it will be. And so this was a real thing. And I think Hamas, as well as other actors, such as Iran, for example, certainly were interested, and the Palestinian Authority, by the way, were interested in preventing that. Saudi normalization would have dealt a very, very severe blow to the aspirations of Palestinians in ending occupation. It would essentially marginalize the Palestinians completely. And so there is no doubt that this had contributed to the timing. There were other factors, however, that were related to the timing, including what was happening in Israel. What was happening in Israel at that time, in particular, the judiciary overall, the reforms, so-called reforms, judicial reforms in Israel, created conditions in which Israel was seen by Hamas and others as divided over this issue, and that this division have shown internal weaknesses. But there were, of course, other factors I'm not going to get into right now, again, just because of time, that were related to the timing. Why was this particular time important? So I would just go back to your question. The Saudi-Israeli normalization was absolutely important, but only in the timing. It was not the reason why Hamas went to October the 7th. It was the reason why Hamas selected that time, that particular time, for October the 7th.
Shai, anything to add?
No. No, my favorite story about the Middle East is about the CNN crew that walks around Tel Aviv looking for the average Israeli that would be able to summarize the situation. And they find one and they say, can you please, and this is CNN, and he said, and can you do this? Like, can you tell the American audience in one word what the situation is? And he says, what, are you kidding me? I mean, there's the Syrians, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iran, and Hamas, and so on and so on. How can I summarize the situation in one word? He said, well, yeah, but see, this is CNN. We don't have time for more than one word. So the guy looks and they go negotiation back and forth. Finally, the Israeli gives up and he says, okay, if there's only one word, I'll tell you, the situation is good. So he looks at you and says, you must be kidding. The Syrians, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, how can you say this? So he said, well, what if we give you 2 words? He says, 2 words? He says, not good. So I'm going to start from Jeffrey. I mean, after Jeffrey and Khalil, and I'm serious, I don't disagree with anything that Khalil said about the factors that brought us to October the 7th, but I fear that half of you would leave early to get to the nearest CVS to get some antidepressants. So what I'm going to do is try to talk about the other half of the question, of the topic, which is where do we go from here? And of course, where do we go from here depends on how do we see, what is our view of history here? And instead of giving you some other options, I will pick one way that I would like to see, that I favor seeing, where we are right now. On more than one occasion in the last few weeks, I've encountered the word inflection and the use of the word inflection. So just to make sure that I understand what does this mean, and making sure that you all understand what inflection means, I went to the dictionary. And the definition that I found is that inflection, an inflection point is where a curve concavity changes, shifting from a curve, for example, shifting from a curve that is going down to all of a sudden go up, or vice versa. So that point in which the curve changes its direction is the inflection point. Now, in world history, probably the most recent and most undisputable inflection point was the end of the Second World War. You had, on one hand, you just passed through 40 years of the worst calamity in world history, totaling with the Holocaust and everything else, about 70 million people died. And the Second World War produced the United Nations, it produced NATO, it produced the European Union, it produced 75 years of peace in Europe until Putin decided to do a little adventure in the Ukraine. And not only that, but two of the starkest examples of dictatorships, Germany and Japan, are now celebrating their 78 years of a pluralist democracy in both cases. So this is the classical case of an inflection point. In the Middle East, we have, I can name at least two very clear ones. One is the October 73 war, the war between Egypt and Israel. The war between Israel and Egypt produced a peace process that began almost immediately with the disengagement of the forces between them. Henry Kissinger had orchestrated negotiations 100 kilometers from Cairo, and then you had the disengagement agreement with Syria, and then you had Sadat traveling to Israel in November 1977, and then there was Camp David, and there was the peace treaty. And that peace treaty was signed in 1979. It's been 45 years of peace between Egypt and Israel. And then, that of course changed everything in the Middle East. Then you had the second one, which is the Gulf War. The Gulf War, again, reminding you, it began with Iraq invading Kuwait. And then the US orchestrated a massive coalition that fought back and essentially forced Iraq out of Kuwait. Smart of Bush 41 of not continuing to Baghdad, okay? But it was an inflection point because the success of the US, the fact that everybody was on board, the Egyptians were on board, the Syrians were part of the US-led coalition. They had their account to settle with the Iranians and so on. And what did that lead to? That led to the Madrid Peace Conference. The Madrid Peace Conference led to the Oslo Agreements. The Oslo Agreements led to the peace between Israel and Jordan that was signed in 1994. So we are already 42 years of peace with. So this was clearly a second case of an inflection point. The point I want to make to you is that this history that we are looking at now, in my view, it's very hard for us to see that. It's much easier to see the problems. Believe me, until you go home tonight, you'll hear more and more of the problems. But the fact of the matter is that this is a classical inflection point because you have a situation in which October 7 was our Pearl Harbor. And the 2 years of war were the 4 years of the war in the Pacific that led to the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. In Palestinian-Israeli history, the horrors of the 2 years of war was equivalent to the Second World War. The numbers go between 60,000, 70,000 Palestinians who died, and that was preceded by a Pearl Harbor, a complete surprise on the Israeli side, and the day in which the largest number of Jews in a single day were slaughtered since the end of the Second World War. Okay? Now what do we have? And that changed everything. So what do I mean by it's changed everything? It goes back to the analytical framework that Khalil talked about. What we are seeing today at the international level and at the regional level is unprecedented. First of all, the involvement of the President of the United States. And the fact that the President of the United States is the first one, by the way, first one in recent history, the history that we've been dealing with the last, let's say that the peace process began in the aftermath of the October 73 war, as I mentioned. We've been through Clinton, we've been through Obama, we've been between that and President Bush, and they've all, President Trump was the first one who exercised the use of American leverage to force the parties to the negotiation table and to agree on something. This was not an accident. What happened, this agreement on ceasefire and hostage release was preceded by months of the personal attention of the President of the United States and a deal that the President made with the Saudis, with the Qataris, with the Egyptians, that you guys deliver Hamas. We need Hamas to release the hostages. But of course, they had their own conditions because Hamas also had conditions. So they made the counter proposals. This is what we need from Israel in order for us to press Hamas to accept the deal. And President Trump, I don't have the tape, but I can guarantee you, President Trump said, don't worry, I'll deliver Israel. And as a matter of fact, he did. We can get into the details, but he did deliver Israel. Since then, you have a continuous American involvement. You know, immediately after the surprise of the hostage release and ceasefire deal that very, very few people believed is coming, for once in my life, I won some bets. For once in my life, I won some bets. And the bet then said, oh, well, okay, so now we have the ceasefire deal. A little bit along the lines of Jeffrey, what he said earlier. Don't be impressed by all these good news. They haven't solved the problem. Of course they haven't solved the problem. But everybody said, well, this is President Trump. We know what he's about. He's focusing on a certain issue. He's going to lose interest. He's going to look for other places and so on and so forth. So a few days after the agreement was signed, his two emissaries that did the actual negotiations, Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were interviewed in CBS. And the interviewer said, well, but how do we know that this is going to continue? I mean, everybody thinks that you're going to lose interest and so on and so forth. So they started to look at one another, Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and finally Witkoff said, you don't understand, we are two developers. As developers, we know that when an agreement is signed, this is when it begins, okay? And we are not going to let anything drift away. And guess what? Jared Kushner and Witkoff were in Jerusalem yesterday, essentially to make sure that Israel complies with its commitments on the next phase of the process that was agreed upon. That's at the international level. At the regional level, we've never seen a region like that. The region is involved, is mobilized now in favor. How did we get to this ceasefire agreement? Because the Qataris rolled up their sleeves, the Egyptians rolled up their sleeves. For the first time, by the way, in the history of the region, did the Turks roll up their sleeves to actually help reach an agreement and so on and so forth. And the Saudis in the background. This is a level of involvement. And in fact, the US, in that sense, the US didn't really had to deal with the day-to-day negotiations with Hamas. The US was negotiating with the Qataris, the Egyptians, and the Turks for them to deliver Hamas. And as I said, President Trump basically said, I'll deliver Israel, and they delivered Israel. So we have a completely different region than the one that we've ever seen before. Lastly, every time we had to deal with a peace process, every time that Khalil and I were trying to help the track one, the leaders, solve anything, right? The first thing we were worried about regarding the productive, or let's say creative proposals that we came up with, was the issue of, so what will the spoilers do? We know in the Middle East, the reason why all these negative predictions are always true about the Middle East is because there are always spoilers out there that are guaranteeing that things will fail. Well, what happened in the last year or so, year and a half, with the spoilers? I mean, the Iranian regime, I don't know if the Iranian regime will fall, but the Iranian regime has never been as challenged, as weak as it is now. Hezbollah and Hamas are at a fraction of what their capabilities were on October 7, 2 years and 2 months ago, a fraction. And we can go on and on. First of all, the spoilers, if you look at this as there was a coalition. The coalition was called the Axis of Resistance. What remains of the Axis of Resistance? And by the way, one of the reasons, there is something called soft power. That's not things that are in a way measured in terms of weapons and ammunition and so on. Sometimes it's measured by the creativity of the leaders. And in fact, three key leaders have lost. They're gone. Nasrallah was a very impressive, I'm telling you, he's an Israeli. Nasrallah was a very, very, very charismatic and creative leader. Creative leaders also make mistakes, and by the way, he paid with his life for the mistake the most recent mistake that he did. Sinwar was a very, very impressive leader. All of these last two deaths were preceded by an assassination that was carried out by the United States, killing Qasem Soleimani, the guy who headed the Al-Quds force, the Iranian Al-Quds force, which was in charge of, first of all, it was his design. The axis of resistance was Soleimani's design. Okay? So the other side lost three very creative, charismatic leaders. It's another measure of why the spoilers are no longer there. And finally, I will add this, because otherwise you'll think I've gone out of my mind completely, is that not only are the spoilers not there, while the bad guys were building the axis of resistance, the US, my personal apology to President Trump, President Biden built a counter-axis, okay? That has to do with, and that counter-axis had to do with a number of Arab states, but it also included Egypt and Jordan, and included some Arab countries that before that already signed the Abraham Accords, which is thanks to President Trump. And another element that's very important where, again, Trump is due his, what he deserves, is a very important decision that President Trump made during the first term, which was to move Israel from the European command to the central command, which is to say the command that's stationed, that has its headquarters in Tampa, Florida, the advanced headquarters is in Qatar, that orchestrates all of American defense, security, military operations in the Middle East. That put the Israeli military officers in the same room with the Jordanian officers, the Kuwaiti officers, the Bahraini officers, and so on and so forth. Now, before the 12-day war with Iran, there were two major confrontations in 24, right? This last one was in June 25. In 24, in April and November 24, there was a massive missile attack, Iranian missile attack against Israel. None of these missiles reached Israel. How come they didn't reach Israel? They were intercepted on the way to Israel. How they were intercepted on the way to Israel? Even by some countries and leaders who were very critical of Israel, of what Israel was doing in Gaza. Maybe among them, the most vocal, and I would say radical in terms of the expressions he used, negative, was the foreign minister of Jordan. Coupled, and the media was paying attention, rightly so, to what the foreign minister of Jordan was saying. But the fact of the matter is that a very large number of these missiles that were launched against Israel were intercepted on Jordanian airspace. So while the foreign minister was saying what he was saying, the Jordanian military was mobilized in the service of, for all kinds of reasons, not all of them were philanthropic. Apparently they knew how to calculate that that's in their interest. So it's not just that we faced in the past, we faced a coalition of spoilers called the Axis of Resistance, except that they lost in every respect. But the president, and this again, I stress that these coalitions that were built in 24 to essentially to limit Iran's capabilities were orchestrated by the Biden administration. And so it was not just that the spoilers lost, but actually there is in place today a coalition of countries that believe that the United States is not all bad, and coalesce against those that are challenging the U.S., challenging the West, challenging Israel as well. Now, this is in the regional front. We'll go into some bad news later. Trust me, Khalil will make sure that I don't forget the bad news. But the point I want to make is we've never seen at the international level, at the regional level, a coalition, a situation, you could call it a disposition of forces that are more conducive to progress, to positive change. This is an inflection point. We are in the middle of it. It's very hard to see. You have to kind of take a step backwards. And I'll end with one word just for Jeffrey, the historian, is that you mentioned something about history, and I will remind you of Fukuyama's famous article, The End of History. And I have an undergraduate student who I'm supervising his honors thesis, and he begins his thesis by a paragraph that says, Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history. He didn't actually clarify, when did history begin?
Let me take that up. And first of all, Eleanor has the note cards if people have questions. This is a good opportunity. Watch for Eleanor coming around. You can write questions on the index cards. We'll get to those momentarily. On the history, so certainly since October 7th, the region and the world has changed dramatically. Iran is certainly weaker. Hezbollah is weaker. Hamas is weaker. I would argue that Israel is weaker, or at least its weakness has been revealed in ways that it wasn't recognized before. NATO is weaker. Russia is arguably weaker, which could be a good sign for many of those. Not NATO, but many of those could be, or Israel, but many of those could be a good sign. However, weaker states are often more dangerous than strong states. And perhaps we saw that in what happened in Iran last week. That's a point where weak states can lash out in ways that strong states often don't. They have fewer interests in stability than strong states do. It creates absences of power, it creates vacuums of power, and that's brings about more potential to explode. So maybe with that kind of observation or prompt, I'll turn to Khalil and ask for your response to perhaps the optimistic portrait, or at least the chances for optimism that Shai spelled out for us.
I thought you were going to ask me to react. Let me do this just telegraphically. Israel is not weaker. Israel bounced back just like the US bounced back after Pearl Harbor. Militarily, Israel is very, very strong. What allows President Trump to do what he does is not because Israel is weaker, it's because Israel is more dependent on the United States. In this configuration, to stand up to the spoilers, Israel needs the US. And the US, to a limited extent, needs Israel. So, and of course, I would say even more so, to connect to, again, things that Khalil was mentioning, like the so-called reform and divisions within Israel and so on. The gap that we face right now in Israel is essentially the gap between the imagination, the creativity, and I would say the forcefulness of the Israeli security community versus the weakness of the political leadership. This is true. Israel today does not have a Ben Gurion. It does not have a Rabin. Okay, so when I said the axis of resistance lost its charismatic leaders, Israeli leadership now is in deep trouble. We don't have, by the way, on the Sinwar is gone. We don't have on the Palestinian Authority side. When you come from the region to the international and the regional to the leadership, to the role of individuals, this is, I promised you to get to the bad news. That is the bad news. The bad news is that what allowed the inflection point, the positive inflection point, for example, the one to be after 73 and after the Gulf War, was that we had Israeli leadership, whether it was Begin or Rabin, and we had Palestinian leadership, whether it's Arafat, and so on and so forth. They're not there right now. That's the problem. That's the biggest deficit we have in the region today, is a leadership that would take this region forward. And for this reason, we are in a way where the role of the outsiders is more important than ever.
So let me turn to Khalil. Maybe I'll ask you also, in addition to talking about the impediments, maybe if you can spell out as well for us what your vision of a peace would look like. Let's get a little bit of the pessimism, a little bit of the optimism in there if we can.
I do agree with Shai on a lot of things he said. The tone is not one that I would share, but the information that Shai presented and the hopes that he certainly indicated, I share. And I think to sum up things that Shai have said, when we look at the involvement of the U.S. and the willingness of a U.S. president to devote such time and energy and to use leverage in such a manner is certainly unprecedented. There might have been one or two cases in the past in relations to the Israeli-Arab or the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the region, by far, is now more involved. Certainly, their understanding that without resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this idea of inward focus, attention paid to economics, normalization with Israel is key, etc., is now giving way to understanding this issue will remain a serious impediment unless we resolve this issue of Israelis and Palestinians who keep fighting. And we need to stop it. So the region is becoming a lot more vital and a lot more involved. However, the reason I'm here in the US is because I'm writing a book. And the book looks at the last 50 years of the Palestinians, looking at what led to all the major transformations in issues related to peace, how Palestinians changed attitudes, changed narratives, moved towards Israeli-Palestinian peace. And what I find is that in all these transformations, it was domestic politics. Transformations in the society, in the nature of the domestic elite, in the nature of the domestic dynamics, socioeconomic and political, that led to these transformations. This is just another way of saying what matters is not what happened in Washington or in the region. What matters is what happened in Tel Aviv and in Ramallah and in Gaza. It is the domestic environment of Palestinians and Israelis that ultimately determine where we go. If the environment is not conducive, the domestic environment in Israel and Palestine is not conducive for us to move forward, then that is a major impediment, and our ability to move forward by pushing it aside doesn't guarantee that we will move forward. We are now pushing it aside. Look at the entire Trump plan. Where is Palestinian agency in this entire plan? It does not exist. There is no it was negotiated by the region with Trump and Netanyahu. There is an Israeli agency, but there is no Palestinian agency. If this is about resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, then this is not going to go anywhere. This is not going to resolve it unless the Palestinians are sitting at the table, just as the Israelis are, and determining the future. Now, there is a good reason why the Palestinians are not sitting at the table. The Palestinians were either represented by Hamas or by Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority today. Abbas has almost no legitimacy whatsoever. Based on surveys the Center Iran conducts on a regular basis, more than 80% of the Palestinians want him to resign. The Palestinian Authority itself is perceived as no longer serving the interests of the Palestinian people. So without legitimacy, and of course, on top of that, before coming to legitimacy, back to the leadership, since October the 7th, in the eyes of the Palestinian people, President Abbas has essentially put himself out of the picture completely. He made himself irrelevant. He has not taken a single initiative to try and protect his own people, play a role at the diplomatic level. This lack of initiative made the Palestinian Authority unable to decisively make a decision regarding October the 7th, or try to address the consequences of October the 7th, or play a role in determining the day after the war in Gaza, and thereby leading to a situation in which the Trump plan completely ignores the Palestinians. So there's a domestic environment in which we're looking at the Gaza war on the Palestinian side and see the horror, the genocide. In the eyes of the Palestinians, Israel has committed a genocide. Israel tried to commit ethnic cleansing in Gaza. In fact, wants to do nothing but that. That's not a country in the eyes of the Palestinians that want to make peace. The Israeli public, in the eyes of the Palestinian public, is fully in support of that. I will disagree with that in a minute, but that is where the Palestinian public is. So what does that produce? The trauma of the war on the Palestinian side has produced dehumanization of Israelis. Exactly what happened on the Israeli side as well. Joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys that I conduct with Israeli colleagues at Tel Aviv University have shown us that these two societies no longer trust each other a bit. The level of dehumanization expressed by Israeli Jews and by Palestinians regarding the other side is almost complete. The idea of reconciliation, accepting reconciliation, is completely out. And that is what we see on the surface. Now, I don't want to end with these impediments. I do want to share something with Shai that is positive. And that is these same surveys that we conduct jointly among Palestinians and Israelis that do show that there is significant negative repercussions for the war for October the 7th and the war in Gaza do not mean that both societies have essentially come to the point that they can't live with each other. We do find in the same surveys that produce all the negative results that we see, when we ask both sides, what is it that you need from the other side? And if the other side is willing to give you what you want, would this change your mind? These same surveys do indicate that the Israeli public, the Israeli Jewish public, and the Palestinian public are both willing to do what I'm about to say, which is to accept a two-state solution based on the 1967, with Palestinians having East Jerusalem as their capital, and the security of Israel is guaranteed, within a context in which there is regional peace and the Arab countries recognize the state of Israel, and Israel is integrated in the region. That is the kind of context we presented for Israeli Jews and Palestinians as meeting their vital needs. And we find in these same surveys, again, that have shown us this huge amount of dehumanization and lack of trust, that there is willingness under such conditions in which somebody is able to guarantee both sides that they will get end of occupation, they will get a two-state, but they will get security and they will get the resolution of all the issues without undermining their sovereignty or their security. We find 50, 60, or even more than 60% on both sides who are willing to accept those. The key, however, is back to the thing that Shai ended up with, which is public opinion, in what I've just said, is not an impediment to peace, but it's not a force for peace. How do you turn that into a force for peace? Only if there are leaders. If there are leaders who are willing to lead, then public opinion, which is not an impediment to peace once again, can then join forces with those leaders to become a force for peace. I can't see Netanyahu doing that. I hope the future leaders in Israel will be able to do that. I can't see Abbas doing that. I can see other Palestinian leaders, like, for example, Marwan Barghouthi, who is currently in an Israeli jail, being able to do that, given his popularity among the Palestinians. So it's a mixed bag. The domestic environment, which in my view is the most vital for making peace, right now is mixed. There are more bad news than good news because it depends ultimately on leaders whom we currently do not have.
The questions, I've got a bunch of questions here that are all very good questions, actually. Some of them, not actually, they're very good questions. There's no reason they wouldn't be very good questions. But they kind of fall into a few groups. So let me ask first. One of them notes that there's a lot of regional agreement on the need for peace and regional and global recognition. But what about the Israelis and Palestinians themselves? You've kind of answered that a little bit, but I'll push on a few other questions that ask, several of which point to the continued discord and violence in the region since the ceasefire. Some of them mention settler violence, the continued killing of people in Gaza, killing of Palestinians in Gaza, Netanyahu's refusal to negotiate on certain terms, Hamas's refusal to disarm. There's a bunch of signs on both sides that would indicate there doesn't seem to be much willingness there, despite the public opinion polls. You kind of commented on that already, but maybe I'll ask either of you or both of you to expand on those obstacles.
This is all part of what I meant by the fact that we're in the event. We're not 5 years or 10 years from the event. It allows us to easily to in retrospect understand where things are. All these or most of the things you mentioned are taking place. So the question is not that. The question is what's their relative importance compared to. Put it this way: if the overall picture was dominated by these undebatable points that somebody made or you made, then this period cannot qualify to be an inflection point. Again, I think it is an inflection point. Again, I don't dispute anything that Khalil said. Just take his last comment about, how Palestinians react or see what happened in Gaza. I want to remind you, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, okay? And it produced and provided the Japanese with a constitution and basically told the Japanese, sign down, okay? This is now your constitution. And now you have to look at this, 75, 78, 80 years later and see what happened. And as I said, what evolved in Europe was after the greatest calamity ever. Now, was this pushed by the Japanese? Was this pushed by the Germans? Were the previous positive inflection points pushed by the population? No. The Israeli population in late 1973, after the 73 war, went to the streets. But they didn't go to the streets to advocate peace. They went to the streets to demand that the leader, who was surprised and did a number of major mistakes otherwise, Golda Meir, has to go home. That's what mobilized the population at that time, to go to the streets or not. But it's not as if Begin reached an agreement with Sadat, or Sadat decided to go to Israel because of what? Population, popular pressure in Egypt or in the Arab world? Look at the region that Sadat had to deal with, okay? Basically, Egypt was penalized by the entire Arab world for the courageous step that President Sadat did. The offices of the Arab League, which is the institution, the Pan-Arab institution, was forced to leave Cairo and move to North Africa because Sadat was, and essentially Sadat was completely isolated in the Arab world, okay? It took a few years, by the way, first for some other governments. By the way, that time the Saudis also were, in a way, were the ones who cracked, who created the crack, and the first Arab League summits and decisions that at least began to pave the way. The Saudis played a major role in the 1980s, and so on and so forth. Was this based on pressure from the Saudi public? Of course not. So, and then Rabin, look, the Israelis were as angry. I mean, yes, nothing compared, as I said, in Israeli history or Jewish history, for this one day called October 7. But remember, Oslo was after the first Intifada. There's 2 years of Palestinian, let's call it resistance, okay? But, and there was no agreement reached around, put it this way, the Israeli public experienced other horrors like the second Intifada, where people were committing Shia, and not only Shia, terrorists were blowing themselves up, and pieces of bodies of Israelis had to be brought down from treetops and so on. 2 years of horror. 2 years in which every time we went to a coffee shop or to a restaurant, we constantly had to look at the entrance, who might be entering, who might not be entering, and so on and so on. Okay? And so what has happened now, again, and nothing that was said about Netanyahu is wrong. Netanyahu is not an architect here. It's not true that this is an American Israeli or a Trump Netanyahu. Trump has as much difficulty pushing Netanyahu along, but of course, this is a match between unequals because Israel is not the United States. Israel is dependent on the United States. Other presidents could have done what Trump did, but they didn't have the guts. He has the guts. So he's using the kind of leverage that was available to US presidents. They just didn't use them. So now we have a whole series of I try to list now. Netanyahu, for all the domestic reasons, was against the ceasefire. He wanted this war to continue for the next 3 or 4 years so that no commission of inquiry will be formed to find the accepted answer to how we got to October 7 and what was his responsibility for how we got to, but he accepted the ceasefire. Then Netanyahu's position, the right-wing position in Israel, was without Qatar and Turkey. These are two Sunni Muslim countries that supported the Hamas and and so on. So. Well, where are Qatar and Turkey? Heavily involved now in all discussions about the future of Gaza. Then Netanyahu said, no, we will never open the Rafah crossings between Gaza and Egypt until Hamas disarms. Well, Rafah crossing will be opened by the end of this month, and we are already on the 26th. And then, as I said, now we have the Trump plan. And yes, just yesterday or the day before, senior Egyptian and Jordanian officers were in Ramallah talking to two members of the security services of the PA, of the Palestinian Authority, about the next steps on the ground in Gaza. Now, does this mean that nothing is happening on the ground? That Trump's 20-point plan is just something that Trump published because he wanted the Nobel Prize? He never denies that he wants the Nobel Prize.
He has it now.
No? Well, no.
Has it? We have only about 8 more minutes, even a little bit less, 7 more minutes. I have 2 questions that I need to get to, so let me interrupt you with and get to those.
No, you haven't. You didn't interrupt.
Okay. The first,
my inflection point was.
Okay, yeah. There's a bunch of questions that ask about about other regions and other countries' involvement. You've touched on some of them, but particularly Turkey. We haven't talked all that much about Turkey's role. Others ask specifically about Qatar's role. And then there's a few questions about Jordan and Syria. And maybe, Khalil, I'll turn to you to see your thoughts on any of those. If any of those countries have the power, the sway to intervene in a productive way right now and bring about positive change.
I do think that the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Qataris by far are the most important. There is no doubt that Turkey has established very strong relationship with Hamas in the past and continues to play a significant role. Its relationship, however, with the PA is much weaker than its relationship with Hamas. Its ability to bring in all the Palestinians together is much weaker than the ability of the Egyptians, for example, or the Jordanians or the Qataris. Nonetheless, there is no doubt that none of these countries pose an impediment. The issue is, are they sufficient? And in my view, they're not sufficient. What is required is to have a peace plan. Trump does not have a peace plan. He has a plan for a ceasefire to stabilize Gaza. This could work. There is no doubt that if he continues to show interest, determination, and the region continues to work along with him, he can stabilize Gaza. But that does not bring about Israeli-Palestinian peace. The developments in the West Bank since October the 7th have all gone in a very negative direction. You've mentioned earlier the settler violence. The settler violence in the West Bank has exceeded all levels we have seen in the past. And the perception of Palestinians regarding Israel's goals and objectives. Israelis and Palestinians will be living together. They will be sharing the same country. There might actually be no way around living together, not just having a peaceful relationship. The reality is a one-state reality. if these two people view each other as existential threats, that they must be eliminated, that makes what people in the street, Palestinians and Israelis, feel about the other side extremely important. It constrains the ability of the leaders to do things, even if they want to do it, assuming there are leaders. The problem is there are no leaders right now who can help take these people towards making peace. And so the region is extremely important. I would fully agree, and I think all these countries are currently doing their best to work with the Trump administration to bring about a stabilization of Gaza.
So let me just add one more thing. I completely and totally agree with what Khalil said about when he used the words at this point. I completely agree with him. So for this audience, for us, I would say, don't even waste time on this question of what would Netanyahu agree with, what he won't agree with. The same with Mahmoud Abbas, with Abu Mazen, the leader of the Palestinian Authority. There have been 26 months since October 7, and this leader has not initiated anything, zero. So, but what's the good news? The good news are two. One is there are elections coming up in Israel in October. And secondly, Abbas is almost 90 years old. Now, if he was a Chinese leader, I would say he's got another 10. But probably not. So the issue is the Israelis hopefully would reflect their preferences that are changing in the next October elections. And hopefully the Palestinians would produce a leader they had in the past. Arafat is a good example. Rabin treated Arafat all of his professional life as a terrorist, and he accepted Rabin as a partner. But Arafat was courageous. He broke ceilings, as Begin did and as Rabin did. As I said, we are now during a period of a leadership deficit in the region. Otherwise, everything would have been happy. So the point about this is, again, but this is us trying to play historians. At least I took upon myself to make it more interesting by saying Khalil was objecting to the tone. He's probably correct. But, there is a difference sometimes between whether something is accurate and whether something is interesting. And I try to make it a little more interesting. And when you have time constraints, which we've broken already, you have to say things telegraphically, so you say them a little sharper than they really are. But this is not to take back that I think we are in an unprecedented point. This is an inflection point, but it takes time. From the time that the 73 war until Sadat came to Israel and began to break, it took 4 years, from 73 to 77. November 77 is when Sadat came to Israel and broke the ceiling, and everything else then follows, 4 years. We're now 2 years and 2 months. Not everything is dandy. The ceasefire is not complete. The spoilers have not gone. They're still there. They're still nitpicking. They're still, and so on and so forth. Yes. And again, one of the things that we cannot escape is the fact that we live in the Middle East, especially in the Arab-Palestinian context. We live in a situation of a leadership deficit. But again, now let's go back and ask, in which Middle East would we prefer to be in? Today, or the Middle East of October 6, a day before October 7? A leader where Syria was under the strong hand of Assad, who butchered 400,000 Syrians in the framework of the civil war, where Hezbollah totally dominant in Lebanon, which is not the case now, okay? Et cetera, et cetera. Or Hamas is what it is, okay? It's again, why are we talking about disarmament? Because Hamas still has some weapons. But what kind of weapons? it has a fraction of what it had on October 6th. So, and we have processes that we've not seen in the region until now. When is the last time that we saw the Egyptians and the Qataris and the Turks rolling up their sleeves to force an Israeli-Palestinian agreement?
I'm going to stop you there to give Khalil the opportunity for the last word. You mentioned the idea of being concise and saying things in sound bites. Maybe I'll ask Khalil to maybe actually model what that could look like, and to really kind of get to the question, to answer the fundamental question of can we move from October 7th and the war to Gaza to peacekeeping? And who is the we?
Peacemaking.
Peacemaking. And who is the we?
I think the we should be Israelis and Palestinians, and it should be citizens who are Israelis and Palestinians, not just leaders.
You see, if you were Trump, you would say, it's me and Shai.
If it is up to me and Shai, we would have made peace a long time ago, I assure you. There is no doubt that there are conducive elements that should make us all optimistic about moving forward. But there are also clear trajectories on the negative side. And they have to do, in my view, on what really matters. Israel is becoming a lot more right-wing, much more national religious than it has been ever in its history. And the Palestinians are losing trust in their leadership. The Palestinian national movement, which led the Palestinians toward making peace, is losing the support of the Palestinian public because of the poor performance of the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas has received a significant hit. So even if Hamas wants to lead towards peace, its ability to do so today is weakened. This environment is not one that we should take lightly. I do hope that eventually Shai would turn out to be right, that with time things would move in a more positive direction. Right now, any statement about the future would be only a guess. There are significant forces that are working against us. There are significant forces that are working for us, for peace. And I think it's too early for us to tell in what direction we will be heading in the future.
Thank you both for your thoughts and for joining us, and thank you everybody for coming. We will be having another one of these dialogues, actually a week from today, over in another room in the Union. I can't remember what room, but on the topic of do monuments matter, with Anush Suni, who is one of our fellows here, and Aaron Thompson, who will be coming in from New York. So hope to see you all next week. And again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you to everybody.